Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Sarasvati Deve Gauravani Pacharane Nirvisesa Sunyavadi Paspachade Satarane Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatham Vitam Stam Sajivam Sadvaitam Sadvadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitamscha Panchakalpachubhischa Kripasindhavyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Okay. February 15, 2025, Personal Rectification Bhakti in Naperville, Illinois. All right. So, we can mess up in all the same ways that other people can mess up. How amazing is that? So what are some of the ways we talked about yesterday that other people can mess up? Breaking community norms. So that would be breaking of the regulative principles. It would also be breaking of the community norms of etiquette, proper behavior in the temple room, right? What other kind of community norms did we have? Well, that's another category. But in community norms, oh, is there some reason why we don't have that one on? Yeah, there we go. What you had there was distracting. Okay, that's another category. So philosophical deviations, and then breaking the law. Okay, so fall down from vows, and on a major level, fall down from vows, I suppose, on a minor level. There's a whole continuum. And then just the way that we're expected to behave as devotees, temple room etiquette, how we behave with other people, and then philosophical deviations and criminal behavior. All right. Is there anyone here who's never messed up on anything in their life? Anybody? One person in the back. Okay. So this is not for you, but you can come so you can teach those other people. I mean, sometimes it's on a minor scale. Like someone asked me this morning, they said I was in charge of a department, and my superior told me to tell one of the people who worked in that department that they had been messing up and that they would therefore be restricted from their service. But when I told them, they were upset, and I felt upset, and I felt that I had broken a community norm. So it can be on that level, and it can be, you leave your spouse and run off with somebody else's spouse. I mean, it can be, there's a range, right? Okay. So when we mess up, you don't have to think about you. You can think about some theoretical. So how does that affect the community? How does it affect the community? Huh? Trust. What else? Relationships. What else? What? Okay. What else? All I heard was to society. But what kind? Be specific. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. It's funny, I'm actually thinking about a particular circumstance where one devotee and I had some uncomfortable dealings, which of course he thought was my fault and I thought was his fault. But yeah. So we'd had some uncomfortable dealings some years previous to this. And then I was one of the founding members of a particular group. I don't want to give details because I don't want you to figure out who these people are. So I was one of the founding members of a particular group, and we were doing a lot of service for the devotees. And I think I'd been in the group for maybe 2 years at that point. We developed a lot of seminars and things like that. And then this other devotee with whom I'd had this difficult situation, he and his wife joined this group, and we were having monthly meetings on the phone. This was before Zoom. It was just phone meetings. And then they started talking about, well, we're going to have a face-to-face. And as soon as we said we're going to have a face-to-face, this devotee went to the head of the group and said, if Urmila's there, my wife and I are not coming, without giving any reason. And so the head of the group came to me, and I said, well, I know the reason. We had a pretty serious disagreement some years ago. But he wouldn't come out and say what it was. And you know, I was talking to the head of the group, and let's see if we can bring it out. Let's see if we can solve it, like that. No. And our next phone meeting, this devotee and his wife didn't come. And the entire meeting, all we talked about was this situation. Couldn't be resolved because he wasn't there. And he refused to engage. And then during the next month, you know, trying to talk about it, trying to resolve it, wasn't getting resolved. Next meeting, again, it was all anybody talked about in the meeting. And then I went to the head of the group and I said, look, this is derailing the whole purpose of this group. We're not making any progress. I said, look, just let them be on and I'll get off. I said, I feel their contribution is more important, and I'll just leave. And I had some interesting lessons that came out of that for myself. But putting that aside right now, because that's not germane right now, it causes some disturbance. It derails what we're trying to do. We see this in general in our movement, right? When somebody messes up something, there's some conflict going on or whatever, then as many years ago, I was in it was an education meeting, and Shanak Rishi of Oxford, he said, you know, sometimes we get into these things and we forget about the blue boy playing his flute. And I'm like, oh yeah, blue boy playing his flute. So yeah, the disturbance can be that people forget about Krishna. That they become sucked into it. So it detracts from like the mission. Any other harm to community? Standard can fall, yes. Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah? Oh, it can form like factions. Is that what you mean? I know of this within one community where one 18-year-old boy who himself had been a victim of molestation as a child molested a 4-year-old boy. The single mother of the 18-year-old was also running the school. And the community split, either saying the 18-year-old, who was a legal adult, should be taken to the police, and saying the 18-year-old should be dealt with within the community with more mercy and so forth. And the temple president, fearing that the school might close, took the side of the 18-year-old and the mother. And there was a split in the community. And the whole community fell apart and has never recovered. I mean, we're talking about a community that had hundreds of members. It's still to this day, it has not recovered. So the school never reopened. The school, I think, had like 100 kids in it. And so, yeah, it forms these kind of factions. I've seen communities split. I've seen communities be destroyed because of this kind of thing. And it can, again, be over something more minor. It can be over he said, who's right and who's on this. Okay? So what about to ourselves and our relationship with Krishna? So what happens when we mess up and it's not properly resolved? What happens to our relationship with Krishna? Okay, so just like the community can't concentrate on Krishna, the community gets all wrapped up in this thing that's going on. So we can get all wrapped up in this thing by the way, that can also happen when other people mess up, right? That we can get, we're thinking about, is this person messed up? This person messed up. So I like to call this a mind loop. We get in a mind loop. The Sanskrit word for this is anusmaram. Smara means to remember, anu means to follow. So anusmaram, you're remembering something over and over and over and over and over and over again. This is what happened with Duryodhana and Bhima when they were fighting. It says in the Bhagavatam that Balaram came to stop the fighting, but he couldn't because both Duryodhana and Bhima were doing anusmaram. But they were doing anusmaram of, I remember when he insulted me. But we can do this with our own things. Oh no, I said this and I did this and now it's going to happen and this is going to, and this might happen and how do I do this and how do I deal with that and how do I deal with that? Okay, so we have this like mind loop that disturbs our own focus, our own ability to focus things. What else? We can lose faith. Oh. Huh? But faith too. Sometimes I think we can lose faith, just like we were talking yesterday, when someone else messes up, we think, how can they really be a devotee if they did this? And we're not just talking about like murder or rape or, we're talking about even how can they be a devotee if they dealt with me like this? Or how can they be a devotee if they dealt with my kid like this? Or how can they be a devotee if they never show up for their services and never tell anybody? And how could they really? So we can think that about ourselves. Gosh, I can't believe that I did that. I can't believe that I said that. I can't believe that I'm struggling with this. I guess Krishna consciousness doesn't work. Otherwise, I wouldn't be having this problem. Shame and, so leave out of shame. Whoa. Leaving out of shame, yeah. Excellent. So physical and mental health. I'm so bad, I'm so fallen, I'm so this, I'm a terrible person. And that affects our physical health. Just by the way, it does. Okay? Beating ourselves up affects our health just as much as someone else, abusing us. You follow? Something that we would recognize as like verbal or psychological abuse from someone else. If we're doing it to ourselves, our brain goes, oh my God, I'm in danger, and our whole systems get out of whack. Yes, brother. Can it lead to humility? Well, that's a good effect. It can. And we were looking at bad effects. Yeah, I like that. I One of the things I like about teaching is how the people I'm teaching can take me wonderful places that I wasn't even planning to go. All right, let's do that. I wasn't planning on doing that, but let's do that. So let's look at, in businesses, and I want you to think of your own experience with this. Are you more likely to leave a good review if everything goes well, or if they mess up and fix it nicely? Isn't that interesting? If you have some dealing with some business and there's no problem, you're just like, well, yeah, there's not supposed to be a problem. Right? Like I flew here on Friday. How did it go? Oh, well, everything was fine. Just normal. Believe me, I didn't go and write a review. Everything was fine and normal. Right? I wouldn't talk to anybody about it. You know, that flight I took on Friday, everything was just normal. Let me tell you the story. You'd be like, oh, no. But you're like, oh my God, this happened and this messed up and that messed up. And they fix it. And how did they fix it? They fixed it like this, and they did this fix and they did that fix, right? Then I'm going to tell everybody about it, and I'm going to write a review about it, and I may send a letter of commendation to the person. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Okay, so now let's look at, oh, I like this. I really like this. I told you the first time I'm teaching this. I'm going to add this next time to my plan. All right. Okay, suppose we mess up and it gets fixed. It gets repaired. Everything gets restored. What's the positive effect on our community? Building trust. Okay. Interesting. What other positive effects on our community? Strong bonding, you said? What else? Oh, you got to come to all my classes. You have such good feedback here. I don't even have room for those headphones you offered to buy me. You know, he said, can I get you some headphones for some noise canceling? I said, I don't have room in my bag. What else happens when we mess up and we restore? We deal with it in a proper way, yeah? Faith gets restored. Who said this? We must be in sync. I must have just downloaded that because I was like, sets a good example for others. And I think that's important because, as I was saying to Sri Radhika this morning, we're all souls. Yes, everybody here, we're all soul, and we're perfect as souls. You read the 50 qualities or 55 of the soul in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. We're all geniuses. We're all beautiful. We're all effulgent. But we're embodied. We're humans in Kali Yuga too. And so, again, everybody messes up, yes? Big ways, small ways, whatever. And if when we mess up, we rectify it properly, that sets an example. Okay, how can you do it? It also, sets an example that it's okay to be a human in Kali Yuga, that we're not expecting you to be, a demigod on Tapaloka. right now. That yeah, I can mess up. And this is how you deal with it. This is how you fix it. This culture of authenticity, it gives people permission and an example and a way to be authentic. And that's important, isn't it? Otherwise, people are going to wallow in this shame. Yeah. And what about the benefit for ourselves of doing proper repair when we mess up? What benefits does it give to ourselves? Yes? I'm sorry. I don't want you taking the time to pass the mics around, but then you're more willing to reciprocate to others. Wow, I like that. What else? Yes. Self-acceptance. Yeah, yes. More humble. Faith, more faith in the process. Okay. So I find that a lot of times people want to know, what tricks and techniques can I have so that I will never mess up? That will be another class. I haven't written that one yet. So that there'll never be any problem. There'll never be any misunderstanding. I mean, those of us who teach various ways of relationships and communication, if we teach them well, we always tell people, look, there's no formula by which there'll never be a problem. All right. So I'd like you to take just a couple minutes and write down what you hope to get from this session. And you do have the handouts with you, right? Okay, we're not ready yet. All right, so we're going to look at some good examples from Shastra, and we're going to look at some bad examples from Shastra, what to do, what not to do. And then we're going to look at a simple, straightforward process of rectification. So we're going to the Chaitanya Charitamrita. And Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he regularly held Sankirtan in the house of Srivas Thakur every night for 1 year. But the doors were closed. It wasn't an open program. It wasn't a public program. It was invitation only. Why? Because they didn't want non-believers coming and making fun. So that happens with us when we do street Harinam. My people go, oh, you Hare Krishna. Of course, we're happy that they're chanting Hare Krishna. But it's a different flavor. There's one flavor when you're going out preaching to the public and risking people making fun and stuff. And then there's another flavor when you're just with very serious devotees. So they were looking for the very serious devotee flavor. But the non-believers, it said, they almost burned to ashes and died out of envy. Right? Maharaj was quoting from Kapila Dev how when we have a separatist mentality where it's like we're making an offering into ashes, our offering doesn't have any effect. So they decided to retaliate. So that's kind of the, if we want to try to analyze what is envy, envy is not just I want what you have, but I don't want you to have it. Or I want you to have less. You know, you can have a nice car as long as my car is nicer, kind of thing. You know, your kid can be smart as long as my kid is smarter. And, you know, it's this, I have to be better. I have to be better than you. And if I can't, then at least, then I want you to lose what you have. Now, Vikasura was interesting. He wanted to become immortal by killing everyone else, which I always thought was a strange strategy. If you killed everybody else, you might still die as well, I suppose, but you'd live longer than everybody else. So that would work. So they decided that they wanted to particularly shame Srivas Thakur because these programs were taking place at his house. So, as some of you may know, in every system of religion, including the Vedic one, so there may be criticisms between different groups. So there was some feeling like this between the Vaishnavas and the Shaktas in Bengal. So this Gopala Champala, who was part of this group of envious people, he put all the paraphernalia for worshiping Durga outside of Srivas Thakur's door. He went at night after the kirtan was over and everybody had gone to sleep, and he basically framed him. In the Bible, when it talks about the 7 deadly sins that the Lord hates, it says the one that he despises is bearing false witness. Getting somebody in trouble for something they didn't do. So he had a plantain leaf, and he put things like, I don't know what all these things are. I don't know what Oda Pula is. Does anyone know what Oda Pula is? No? And turmeric and vermilion and sandalwood and rice and wine. He also put wine. Just see, Srivas Thakur is secretly offering and drinking wine. So Srivas Thakur gets up in the morning and he sees all these things outside of his door. Now, his response to this is very interesting. Generally, if somebody does something like this to us, we become defensive. If someone accuses us of something we didn't do, we usually become defensive. And I really like, there's, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Saint Teresa of Avila. She lived in Spain around the same time as Mahaprabhu. She was a Carmelite nun, which meant they followed the 4 regulative principles in their practice. And she wrote a book called The Interior Mansions, which was recommended to me by John V. Harrison, where she talks about attaining the stage of Madhurya Bhav with the Lord. So it's quite an interesting book. But anyway, she also has a book of instructions, because she became a mother superior in a convent, to the sisters in the convent about what to do when people blame you unjustly. And her response is nothing. Don't do anything. Just ignore it. She said the only time you should do something is when, by not saying something, people would get hurt. Other people would get hurt. And her rationale for this is, she said, God gets blamed unjustly. Why should we as his servants not be willing to suffer that? And she said, what about all the things I do wrong that nobody criticizes me for? You know? So if I'm criticized for this, and I must have some fault involved with that. And she says that if the Lord wants to defend you, he'll do it. That you don't have to do that. And she says you then end up with a freedom that when people are criticizing you, you almost feel like they're talking about somebody else. You feel like it has nothing to do with you. And she says this is also very nice preaching, that people will be very astonished at your behavior. They'll be very surprised. Why is this person not defending themselves? So Srivas Thakur doesn't defend himself at all. In fact, not only does he not defend himself, he actually agrees with the whole thing. He says, okay, everybody, you know, because everyone's up in the morning and they're walking around Navadvip, and he says, okay, I guess I've been outed here. He says, now you know that after the Sankirtan with Mahaprabhu, that I worship the goddess Bhavani. He says, you can all tell the paraphernalia was here, and this is the evidence that I'm actually guilty. And now all of you can understand my position. So the assembled gentlemen there, their response was, what is this? Who's done this? And they called for a sweeper. They said, come clean this up. Take care of this. So they didn't believe Srivas Thakur. They immediately decided that he had been framed. So Gopal Chapala, after 3 days, he came down with leprosy. Now, we don't always get such swift reactions when we mess up, thankfully. Thankfully. And blood oozed from sores all over his body. He was incessantly covered with germs, and insects were biting him all over, and he felt unbearable pain, burning in distress, and he left the village. So he had a very strong, clear evidence that he had messed up. That doesn't always happen. So one time many years ago, I was in Auckland, New Zealand on Govardhan Puja, and I was telling the Govardhan Puja story, and I was talking about how Indra was the offender, but he thought that who was the offender? He thought Krishna and the residents of Vrindavan were the offenders. He thought he was the victim. Right? That was his view was, I'm the victim, they're the offenders. So when I was talking about that, I brought up that I had been, this is a completely different group, completely different situation than I mentioned before. So I was part of a very different group. And I was very convinced that they had offended me, and I left the group. And for years, I would be like, they really offended me. So 10 years later, I was talking to one of my very, very dear friends. And she said, how come you're not a member of that group? It seems like you should be out in that group. And I said, well, I was, but they were really offensive, and so I left. And she said, well, what happened? So I told her the story, and she looked at me, she said, it sounds like you were the offender. And I immediately felt a lot of anger. And then I looked at her and I said, I'm feeling a lot of anger, so you must be right. And then I actually went to the people involved and rectified things. So I told that in the middle of my class on Govardhan Puja as an example of how it's entirely possible to be the offender and think that you're the victim. So at the end of the class, there was one gentleman, I think it was maybe his second or third time at the temple, and he said, why does Krishna let people stay in the Hare Krishna movement for 10 years after they've been offenders? I said, you're talking about me, right? He said, no, it wasn't about you. So, I mean, sometimes it's not that obvious. Sometimes we don't just like come down with leprosy. You know, sometimes we can go on for quite some time not realizing that we're the one who messed up. We're just clueless. Sometimes we mess up, we don't know that anything happened. You know, I've had people call me and say, you know, you offended me 15 years ago, and I don't have no recollection of what they're talking. What happened? So sometimes we're completely oblivious, or sometimes something happens and we think it's somebody else. But here it was very clear. All right, so he saw Lord Chaitanya, and Gopal Champala saw Lord Chaitanya. He said, my dear nephew, I am your maternal uncle in our village relationship. So even today, often in India, people call a woman who's older than them auntie, and a man who's older than them uncle. Yes? Yes. My daughter runs a Bharatanatyam dance academy, and all of her Indian students call her auntie. Yeah. So he said, you know, I'm your uncle, you're my nephew. He said, your maternal uncle, not just uncle, maternal uncle. Please see how greatly I'm suffering. As an incarnation of God, you're delivering so many fallen souls. I'm also a fallen soul. Please deliver me. This is often what we do when we're having some difficulty. We say, Krishna, please help me. And there's a kind of subtle thing here. I've concluded, at least in some cases, we don't really want freedom from the anartha. We want freedom from the suffering that comes from the anartha. You understand? Like we want to be able to eat unlimitedly but not get fat or stomach aches. You know, it's just like, I don't want to give up my bad behavior. I don't want to rectify myself. I don't even want to know what I did wrong. I don't even want to understand what I did wrong. I don't want to be introspective. I just want to get rid of the suffering. And I don't know what the percentage is. I haven't like tabulated it. But, you know, a lot of people come to me over the years. I mean, it's probably now in the thousands that ask for my help with various things. And sometimes it's in this category. You know, they just want the suffering to go away. They don't actually want to address the problem. They don't even want to know what the problem is. So Lord Chaitanya's response to this was pretty intense. He says, "Oh, sinful person, envious of pure devotees, I shall not deliver you. Rather, I shall have you bitten by these germs for many millions of years. You have made Srivas Thakur appear to have been worshipping the goddess Bhavani. Simply for this offense, you will have to fall down into hellish life for 10 million births." Right? Someone noticed this yesterday when we were talking about Mahaprabhu's pastimes. Somebody brought this out, how, you know, has the mood of Srimati Radharani, who's the compassion of the Lord, but yet he can be pretty heavy. He can be pretty intense. Okay, and then Mahaprabhu went to Jagannath Puri, and at one point he came back from Jagannath Puri to Kulia, and at that time again Gopal Champala took shelter of him. Now this is a little different, taking shelter. It's a subtle difference, but it's a difference. If I go to you and I say, get rid of my suffering, fix my problems, that's different than saying, I surrender to you, I take shelter of you, I don't know what to do. You please help me. You please help me. Now, it's interesting, the story I told before, where I was part of this group and one person didn't like me and so forth. And I remember after the second phone meeting, I sat down and I said, okay, Krishna, why is this happening to me? What's going on here? And I said, what's my fault in this? I said, because I was really displeased with how he was dealing with it. I was displeased with the fact that he was going to the head of the group without giving any kind of specific reason, that he wasn't discussing any reason with the whole group. And I said, have I ever done this to anybody? Is this some sort of reaction for something that I've done? And then immediately, the sweet, kind Lord in the heart revealed to me 3 times that I had done something like that. Just immediately. And I tried to write emails of apology to all 3 persons, and one of them I evidently had the wrong email address, didn't go through. So I ended up calling him, and in the process of calling him, I got so much of a greater insight into how he experienced the whole situation. So going to the Lord saying, hey, fix my problem, and going to the Lord saying, I've come to you for shelter. Please actually show me what's happening and what I can do. It's a very, do you understand the difference in mentality? So then Lord Chaitanya he responded completely differently. Completely differently. He said, you've committed an offense at the lotus feet of Srivas Thakur. You must beg for his mercy, and if he gives you blessings and you do not commit such sins again, you will be free from these reactions. So the first time he just condemns him for 10 million births in hell. And now he says, look, this is what you got to do. So Gopal Champala went to Srivas Thakur. He took shelter of him, and Srivas immediately excused him. And by Srivas's mercy, he was free from his sinful reactions, and he was free from his suffering. So this is a good example, ultimately, of how Gopal Champala dealt with a very serious mess up, where he eventually dealt with it properly. Okay, here's another interesting example, that of Parikshit Maharaj. So it says in the Bhagavatam, Matsara, that Maharaj Parikshit was actually envious of the sage. Interesting, huh? Like, who do you think you are, not giving me water? I don't know exactly how he asked for water, but he was the emperor, and he was very thirsty, and maybe he said, water, water. I don't know. And the sage is just... I mean, this is another interesting example where Parikshit thought that he was the victim, but he was actually the offender. Right? So in anger and retaliation, he puts this dead snake around the sage's neck. But in Bhagavatam 119.1, it says, when returning home, the king felt the act he had committed against the faultless and powerful Brahmana was heinous and uncivilized. Consequently, he was distressed. Right? This might have happened to us, right? In the moment, somebody does something, somebody says something, we interpret it in a particular way, and we respond in a defensive or aggressive way. And then later, after the biochemicals pass through our body and we're not flooded with adrenaline and cortisol and our brain works. And that's something, by the way, just something that's important to understand. Our bodies are designed by the Lord, or by Lord Brahma, that if there's a threat, we go into what's called the sympathetic nervous system, and our bodies change biochemically. We're set for fight or flight, or freeze. And our digestion stops, because you don't want to pour energy into digestion when there's a pack of wolves after you, right? Your immune system stops, and the energy is in your arms and legs, and also your higher order thinking skills stop, which is why people can't philosophize when they're very distressed. You just don't have the capacity. You have this narrow focus on dealing with the situation and defending yourselves. You really can't think clearly. And it's probably a good idea not to just act in those situations. Well, that's a very hard thing to do, but to be able to kind of step back and go, oh, this is just the natural response of the body. So eventually that generally fades. If there isn't an actual threat, it will fade in 90 seconds. If there's a real threat, it's meant to stay like for 20 minutes. Although, like Hiranyakashipu stayed angry at Vishnu his whole life. Which, by the way, showed up in how he treated others. It said he was always yelling at the demigods for no reason. I don't know if you know people like that. Hopefully you're not one of them. So anyway, after he responds inappropriately, you know, the chemicals are out, and he's going back to his palace, and he's thinking, maybe the sage was really in a trance. Maybe he wasn't just being disrespectful. And if he was really in a trance, then oops, I really messed up. And although he was the emperor, the sage, being a Brahmana, was his superior. And he's like, I really messed up. So Prabhupada writes in his purport to 119.1, the pious king regretted his accidental improper treatment of the powerful Brahmana. Why accidental? In other words, it wasn't premeditated. who was faultless. Such repentance is natural for a good man like the king, and such repentance delivers a devotee from all kinds of sins accidentally committed. The devotees are naturally faultless. Accidental sins committed by the devotee are sincerely regretted, and by the grace of the Lord, all sins unwillingly committed by a devotee are burnt to ashes in the fire of repentance. Now, I don't know how many of you are going to be able to come tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning, we're going to look at the relationship between penance and bhakti in general, because sometimes we think, well, if I'm doing bhakti, I don't have to do any repentance. But it's actually, it might be part of bhakti. This is a sentence that's really stuck with me since the first time I read it. All sins unwillingly committed by a devotee are burnt to ashes in the fire of repentance. So the king's going home and he's thinking in 119.2, due to my neglecting the injunctions of the Supreme Lord, I must certainly expect some difficulty to overcome me in the near future. I now desire without reservation that the calamity come now, for in this way I may be freed of the sinful action and not commit such an offense again. When you pay for things later, it's usually with interest. Yeah. But we were talking yesterday how Prabhupada says that it's beneficial for the criminal to get punished by the government, because then they don't have to suffer in their next birth. The punishment of being executed by the government is nothing compared to the punishment they're going to have to suffer in the next birth. So he's saying, let it come to me now. Let me get it immediately. Prabhupada writes in the purport to this verse, a man's personal misconduct affects all his family members. Yeah? Maybe indirectly, subtly, but it definitely does. If a family member is a criminal, it makes your life difficult as well. And sometimes people in the community may even shun you because of your relationship with them. Going on what Prabhupada says, therefore Maharaj Parikshit desired the calamity to fall on him alone. By suffering personally, he would be restrained from future sins, and at the same time, the sin which he had committed would be counteracted so that his descendants would not suffer. This is the way a responsible devotee thinks. So, materially, we tend to think the opposite. I've done something wrong. I'm like, I hope I don't get caught. I hope nobody knows. I hope there's no reaction. I hope I don't suffer for this. But here the devotee is saying, oops, I really messed up. Well, I don't want anyone else to have to suffer for this, and I don't want to have to suffer double or triple later. Let me take care of it now. I mean, we can look at this legitimately, and Prabhupada does repeatedly in this section, as the Lord's pastime, that the Lord bewildered Parikshit because he wanted the Bhagavatam to be spoken, and he wanted Parikshit relief from his current situation, and so forth. That is a lens through which we can look at this, but that's not the only lens. Does this make sense to everybody? If we look at everything just in terms of the lens of, oh, this is all Leela, then I find it's not very relatable. Yeah? I mean, I remember when I was first reading Prabhupada's books, and we were reading Prabhupada's books, as soon as they were translated, we had a hot off the press account. We'd get the recordings of Prabhupada's lectures and Prabhupada's books, like as soon as they were there. So we were going through the Bhagavatam, and honestly, I found some of these things hard to relate to. Like, I don't know, I've never, at least not in this life, I don't remember in other lives that I've ever been traveling around the universe in a flying city, and, these things were just like, what does it have to do with me? And when the Chaitanya Charitamrita came out, I felt almost like I was reading the Sankirtan newsletter, from the other temples, and I thought, okay, this is more something that I can understand. But actually, all of these examples in the scriptures there's some way that we can relate to ourselves. There's some way that it's meaningful to ourselves. Okay, another example, we brought this up yesterday in when other people mess up, but here's also an example that could be applicable to ourselves. Not that we should go commit suicide, but the fact is that Junior Haridas decided, I need to do some sort of penance. I messed up and Mahaprabhu is not excusing me, and I need to rectify this in some way. A very interesting example is Madhavinda Puri. So Madhavinda Puri, he's on a mission from God, literally, to get sandalwood paste and camphor. And on the way, he stops in Maimuna, and he sees that they're offering this kheer. And he thinks, I've heard about this kheer. I've heard about this. They only offer it here. They don't make it any other place. There's something really special about it. Wow, that'd be really, really nice if I could make it for Gopal. I don't know if they'll tell me how they make it, though. Maybe it's their secret. So perhaps, if you're a really good cook, sometimes just by tasting something, you can figure out, okay, it's got this spice or this thing, right? So he thought, well, maybe if I tasted some, but he thought this while the offering was going on. Now, it's interesting because his desire to taste the kheer was seva. He wasn't thinking, I want to taste the kheer to taste the kheer. Madhavinda Puri had a vow that he wouldn't eat even by begging. He would only eat if people voluntarily came to him and offered to feed him. Now, all of you went to Maharaj's class yesterday. You would have all run to be the first to feed Madhavinda Puri, so that you wouldn't consider your belly more important than others. But, that isn't always the case. We don't necessarily assume that everybody's hungry. So sometimes he would fast. So a person who is that detached from eating, you have to be really detached from eating, that you don't make any effort to eat whatsoever. Nothing. You don't beg. He's not wanting to eat this kheer for his own sense gratification. It was service. But still he thought, oh no, that Krishna hasn't finished eating it. I'm an offender. So he immediately left, and he thought, well, I'll just sleep in the deserted marketplace and I'll leave in the morning. And then the priest, of course, has this dream that the Lord had stolen. I mean, that's also funny that he stole it. I mean, it's his own sweet rice that was offered to him. I always wondered how is he a thief of his own stuff? Always wondered about that one. So he hid one of the pots of sweet rice behind his cloth and brought it to Madhavinda Puri. I mean, what's also interesting, it's kind of a side note, that Madhavinda Puri didn't want to be praised that the Lord had done this, so he left that night, but of course said the praise followed him wherever he went. But I thought it was interesting that as soon as he realized, okay, I've done something wrong, even though ostensibly it really wasn't something wrong, immediately thought, okay, I'm not going to get the sweet rice. Forget it. I won't taste the sweet rice. I desired it improperly. Let me immediately go. And then what Maharaj talked about this morning, the example of Durvasa Muni. So this is quite an example. So Durvasa Muni is actually a partial manifestation of Lord Shiva at Shivaratri today. And we've changed the program. I'm going to talk about Lord Shiva today for the Sunday feast. So he was traveling and he came to the house of Ambarish Maharaj, and he came on the time to break Ekadasi. And Maharaj Ambarish needed to break his fast, and Durvasa Muni says, well, let me go bathe first before I have something to eat. And there's this etiquette that you don't eat. If you have a guest, you feed the guest first before you eat. We don't so much have that in American culture. And like sometimes when I visit people from Asian cultures and they're just standing there while I eat, I'll say, can you pretend you're an American and like sit with me and eat with me? But there's this idea, first I have to feed my guest and then I eat. So Maharaj Ambarish was thinking, what am I going to do? I have this conflict. Yet a conflict between, okay, I want to do my service to the Lord, which is eating and fasting and breaking fast in the proper way, and I want to do my service to the Lord by taking care of this guest. So he just took a little bit of water, which can be considered fasting and not fasting, although he had been fasting from water, so the water broke his fast, but you could still say, well, his fast wasn't completely broken. So Durvasa Muni comes back, Now, this is another example of mixing up who's the offender. By the way, this is called DARVO, defend, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. You can look it up. DARVO, D-A-R-V-O, defend, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. So I'm the one who's done something wrong, okay? I'm the offender, but when you say to me, hey, you did something wrong, I defend myself, I attacked you, and I reverse victim and offender. So that's what Durvasa Muni did here. So he decides Ambarish Maharaj has offended me by drinking some water. Look, honestly, there's been some times that I've gotten disproportionately upset about what somebody's done in later reflection. Okay, just to be very honest, there's sometimes I've gotten really upset about something, and upon reflection, it's like it was a big nothing. Sometimes you can't even remember a few years later, like, I remember we got in a big argument. What was that about? I have no idea. But Durvasa Muni, he tries to kill Ambarish. Now, again, I have not done that, at least not in this life or any life that I can remember, but he tries to kill him for drinking water first. Imagine. Just imagine that. Imagine you go to, you're a guest, you come in someone's house, you come in the door, they're drinking some water. Die! I mean, who's the offender here, folks? Durvasa is the offender, isn't he? That's really, that's like top level. You can't get any more offensive than murder. Over a sip of, and he probably just took like a drop, like we take, when doing Achman, just symbolic. He wasn't like, I gotta break my fast, and he's ready to kill him. He's ready to kill him. Of course, it's interesting how Ambarish Maharaj responds to this, very much like Srivas Thakur. So he's like, okay, you want to kill me? Fine. By the way, I feel very certain that Ambarish Maharaj would not respond like this on the battlefield as a king. So this was an instance where the person was his guest and was a brahmana and was a renunciate. So the person was socially superior to him on 3 levels. As a guest, as a renunciate, and as a brahmana. He's a kshatriya grahasta, who's the host. So he's feeling, I have violated etiquette, and if I have to die for violating etiquette, so be it. I accept. Sampade vipade jivane marane. Fine. So then, of course, the Sudarshan Chakra, like Maharaj brought up, how did Durvasa Muni outrun Sudarshan? Sudarshan is also time, by the way. How do you outrun time? And he's the master of speech, as described in this. Just some little side notes that have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. But the Sudarshan is time, he's the master of speech, and according to Kavi Kanapur, Sudarshan is what lights up the whole spiritual world and all of Goloka Vrindavan, and Sudarshan also dries up the water of Indra during the Govardhan Lila. I like Sudarshan. So Sudarshan is following Durvasa Muni all over the universe, and Durvasa Muni is going to the Devas, help me, help me, help me, help me, help me. Reminds us of Gopal Champala, right? Going to the Lord, just help me get rid of the problem. They say, we can't do anything, and he goes all the way to Vaikuntha, which is also interesting because we had that question yesterday, how can someone be a devotee and yet mess up, right? He was able to go to the gates of Vaikuntha. And Lord Vishnu is like, I'm sorry, I can't help you. Said, the devotee is in my heart, I am in the heart of the devotee. And if you have offended my devotee, there's nothing that I can do. You have to apologize to my devotee. Prabhupada talks about how, love me, love my dog. Right? Or those of us who have children, we know that somebody who offends or hurts our child, we're much more upset about that than if they offend us. There's just not even any comparison. By the way, that's one of the things that makes it difficult to be a teacher. You know, if you go to the parents, sometimes you have to go to the parents and say, hey, your kid was misbehaved, or your kid did this, and sometimes the parents become your enemy because you brought up that their child is, you know, God's gift to the world. So Krishna feels like this about his devotee. He's very protective of his devotee. And Prabhupada says the devotee, in regard to this Ambarish pastime, the devotee doesn't need to have mystic power because Yogeshwara, the Lord, is always there with his power to protect the devotee. So Durvasa Muni comes and he falls at the feet of Ambarish. And he genuinely apologizes. And then Ambarish prays to Sudarshan, which is in one of the prayers he calls him, O Master of Speech. Clear vision, Sudarshana. By the way, Durvasa Muni and Ambarish become very good friends after this, as it says in the Bhagavatam. So it has a very happy, with this restoration of trust. So not only restoration of trust, but they were able to build a new relationship. And again, this is the interesting phenomena that we're often more pleased with proper dealings with improper behavior than if no improper behavior ever occurred. So it's an interesting phenomena here. So, of course, it was mentioned one of the reasons to have proper rectification is to set a good example. So even if we think we didn't do anything wrong, actually, making some effort to rectify sets a good example. I mean, interestingly, with the example that I gave with that group and the person who criticized me, I really don't think, I mean, to this day, I don't think I did anything wrong either in my dealings with that person, or certainly not in the group. Although Krishna showed to me that I'd done things wrong with other people. But I thought I need to set an example here and put the mission of the group over me. So I don't know, any of you who are into management and leadership might have read the book by Jim Collins, Good to Great. It's a classic in management. And he talks about what he calls level 5 leadership. And one of the things he talks about is that these top leaders, they put the mission of their organization above their ego. They put the mission of the organization above their ego, and he gives many ways in which they do that. One of the ways he talks about it, he says when things go well, they look at the room. They look out the window or at the room, and when things go poorly, they look in the mirror. In other words, when things go well, they give the credit to others, and when things go poorly, they take responsibility themselves. So sometimes, even if we feel that we've been accused unjustly or somebody's angry at us unjustly, rather than just defending ourselves and rather than just like saying, well, I'm just going to hold on to this position, you know, sometimes acting humbly is not called for, okay? There are times when it's not called for to act humbly. I can give you a couple of examples. But generally speaking, we only profit by being humble. We don't lose. A couple of examples that I like to give in this regard. So when my mother first visited the temple after I joined, a month after I joined, she asked the temple president, that was in Evanston, Sri Govinda, she said, what are your qualifications for being temple president? And he said, well, I don't have any qualifications. He said, my spiritual master asked me to do this. And, you know, out in the world, that does, you know, you're thinking of of investing your money with a bank or something. You go to the head of the bank, and so what's your qualification? Well, I don't have any qualifications. So you're going to do this surgery on me? What's your qualification? So for the next 10 years, my mother said, you know, your leaders aren't qualified. So, you know, like Narada Muni told that snake disciple, he said, don't bite. And so then later he came back and how's it going? And the snake said, well, I stopped biting, but all the kids are throwing stones at me. And Narada said, well, then raise your hood. So there are certainly some times when we don't want to take the external trappings of humility. I mean, another very practical time is like if I'm going to give a lecture to an audience that doesn't know me, so people introduce me. And when they're introducing me, they're saying all the good things about me, right? They don't say, oh, you know, Urmila messed up that time 10 years ago. Right? They're just praising me. And I'm sitting there. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati talks about this. He said, I'm like a big zoo animal, you know, being praised. But, you know, I thought a lot about it. And why do we do that? Because if people won't hear you, if they don't have any trust in you, if you don't know what you're talking about. There was one devotee who said, I'll give Bhagavatam class, but I'll sit on the floor. And I said, hey, if you're going to dance, you don't wear the veil. Like, if you're qualified to give the class, then you're qualified to give the class. You know, make up your mind one way or the other. So my point is there are some times when externally, ostensibly, we're not going to be acting in a way that we would call humble. But internally, humility is always good. And there's such a wonderful discussion of Brihad Bhagavatamrita about the fact that prem, Vrindavan prem for Vrajraj Krishna, must be accompanied by danya, must be accompanied by humility. Without total humility, one cannot have love. And I don't have time to get into this in depth, but I think Maharaj talked about entitlement. You talked about entitlement, right? In your first class. Basically, humility and entitlement are diametrically opposed. And when you have a feeling of entitlement, you can't love. There can't be any gratitude, right? You know, your husband gets the oil changed and fixes the door, and you're like, well, he's supposed to do that. That's his job. You know, then there's no love. You understand? Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. So humility is I don't deserve anything, and so everything I get, I feel grateful for. It's not self-hatred. So humility is always good, and even if we're convinced that we really have no fault in the matter, unless saying that we're at fault is going to cause some harm to something else. But even if we feel we have no fault in the matter, taking a humble position and rectifying it is good for our development of humility and good for setting an example. This is at least what I found. And we might, surprise, realize later that maybe we did have some fault there. It's possible, even in the times when we're 100% convinced I didn't do anything wrong. All right. So now we're going to go on how to do this, and now we are ready for our handout. Oh, distracted participant. Oh, okay. All right, there we go. Okay, so I have it in detail on the sheet. This is just a little summary on the slides. So first of all, acknowledging that there's been an offense, that there's something, acknowledging that something actually happened that was wrong. One thing that became glaringly clear to me, as part of getting my PhD, I had a job as a vice principal in a public school. And it was the only time since joining the Hare Krishna movement that I had, like a regular job in the world. And I learned many things from that. But one of the things that I learned was that most materialistic people think that they're perfect, powerful, and happy. They don't even have a theoretical acknowledgement that they might be overcome by lust, anger, envy, greed, illusion, and madness. See, we may not believe that in our heart, but at least we accept it as a theory. And I'd often been irritated by what I considered superficial humble talk in the Hare Krishna movement. Oh, Prabhu, I'm so fallen. I'd always thought, yeah, it's just superficial. But when I was with people who didn't even have that superficially, then I came to admire it and say, wow, at least there's a theoretical understanding that I'm fallen. And I saw what most materialistic people do is they say, you know, I'm a good person. Sometimes I do bad things, but that's inadvertent, and I'm basically a good person. Years ago, I read an article from a woman whose father, unbeknownst to the children and the wife, was a serial killer. He was called the bind, torture, killer. And when he was apprehended and put in prison, he would write letters to his daughter, and she wrote a book about it. I didn't read the book, but I read an article about it. And she said that her father wrote her this letter saying, well, you know, I made some mistakes in my life. You know, you're capturing random people, tying them up, torturing them, and killing them, and you're saying, well, I made some mistakes. So the first thing is to recognize, I actually hurt somebody. It wasn't a mistake. I actually hurt somebody. Even whether it was knowingly, unknowingly, whether it was intended, not intended, it doesn't matter. I actually hurt somebody. There was some real harm here. Then an explanation, but an explanation that is not an excuse. Not an excuse. And attitudes indicating remorse. You have this on your handout, so you don't have to copy things down from the slide. Attitudes and behaviors indicating remorse, shame, humility, and sincerity, and reparations, if possible. Okay, so to have a good apology. So first of all, figuring out who's responsible, who's at fault, and who is hurt. You don't apologize to God for hurting Srivas Thakur. Okay? Who is actually hurt here? Who's responsible? Am I responsible? Even if it may have been inadvertent. When I was running a Gurukul, we had one devotee who would teach bhajans in the morning, and he wanted copies of some songs to teach the kids. So I made some copies and put it in a used large envelope and stuck it on his desk. And the next day he came to me and he says, I have to leave immediately. I said, why? He said, I have to leave the school. I may even have to leave the country. I'm like, why? He said, well, the IRS is coming after me. I'm like, what? He said there was an envelope on my desk from the IRS. So, I mean, that was 100% inadvertent. So even if it's completely inadvertent, still somebody was hurt. Okay? Somebody was hurt. So to who was hurt? And finding the right person. You don't apologize to the wrong person. You actually apologize to the right person. And it may be persons. And then acknowledging the offending behaviors in adequate detail. Now, what I found here is that if I just talk about what I did on an objective level, that doesn't do it. You know, well, I told you I'd be there at 3, and I forgot all about it, and you were all ready to go, and then we never went, and, you know, that's an objective detail, but the offending behavior wasn't that. The offending behavior was a breach of trust, or being irresponsible, which got translated to the other person as uncaring, that I didn't really care about them, that I prioritized something else, that I was insensitive in some way. That's what really bothers people. It's not just exactly what you did. I mean, I guess if you like punch them and break their nose or something, but it's not just what we did, but it's what it means to them. And you can't do a backwards NVC and say, well, that's just your interpretation of the event. You have to take their interpretation, so that's how it felt to them. It felt to them that there was some breach of trust, there was some breach of consideration. Does that make sense? And the easy way to think of this is, how do we feel when people do things that are upsetting to us or that hurt us in some way? we're very rarely only looking at the objective external behaviors. We're looking at what those objective external behaviors mean. What do they indicate? And the closer the relationship with the person, the more serious that kind of thing is. You know, if it's a person that you share your passwords and your bank account with and your car keys with, and it's more serious than somebody who's just like an acquaintance. But even just a general norm of what's expected behavior. What can I expect? Or just people weren't considerate, or they didn't hear my side of the story. They didn't care what I thought about it. They didn't care about me. So this means to take a moment. You know, Mars is talking about the udaram, that other people's stomachs are as important as mine, and other people's hearts and minds are as important as mine as well. That, how did this feel to them? How did they experience it? We have a strong tendency to assume that if I didn't intend harm, or I just was a little careless, or maybe I was just whatever, that the other person shouldn't take it so seriously. And maybe that's true, but that's between them and God. That they have to work out. From my perspective, if it was something that they took seriously and it really hurt them, then to acknowledge that they were really hurt. Yeah? So that's inadequate detail. And I found again, doing this is not easy, but it's very rewarding. It's very rewarding because it feeds your own humility. And when it feeds your own humility, it feeds your own love. And it's quite dramatic, actually. It's very, very satisfying. I will give one caveat. If you are dealing with people who have serious psychological problems, if you are dealing with people, and we tend to call anyone we don't like a narcissist today, or any difficult person, they become a narcissist. The narcissist is actually in the, the DSM? I was going to say the DMV, but that's where you get your license. It's really in the DSM, you know, narcissism, being a psychopath, being a sociopath. There are people who are seriously warped, where if you reveal any weakness to them, they will use it against you. And I have dealt with two people like that, actually, even in the Hare Krishna movement. So there are sometimes people like that. But that's not like your general population. Please don't assume that anyone whose behavior you don't agree with is a narcissist. Like, generally speaking, becoming vulnerable like this will build trust and builds relationships. And ultimately, the person we're becoming vulnerable with is Krishna. What we're really doing is we're really admitting to Krishna, I'm doing something that's opposed to my relationship of love to you. So recognizing the impact and confirming that this was a violation of the social or moral contract between the parties. Okay? So, I spoke to you harshly in front of your kids, and that made you feel embarrassed. It must have been an awkward situation for you. And I've really broken respect. I've broken consideration. I didn't treat you with proper respect. I didn't follow proper etiquette. That's pretty clear? Okay, let's just briefly look at some not so good examples. So Indra apologizes to Krishna after the Govardhan Leela. That was a pretty grievous offense where he tries to kill all the residents of Vrindavan and all the cows. And he says, you know, please make sure this never happens again. And then when Krishna does him a favor by returning the earrings and umbrella of his mother, Aditi, and then takes a tree, I'm sure Indra had more than one parijata tree, you know, and Krishna had just given back the earrings and umbrella of his mother, and he begrudged him the tree so much he started fighting with him over it. So that wasn't a genuine apology, was it? It looked like a genuine apology, but as soon as there was some other little thing, and it was again a situation of Darvo. It was again a situation where he's like, Krishna, you're the offender. Another example is Kamsa. That Kamsa, after the girl child appears in the sky as Durga, he apologizes. I'm so sorry. I acted like a demon. I acted just like a demon in killing all of your children. Of course, he makes some excuses. He says, but it must have been your karma. And then just a couple days later, he gets convinced by his friends to start persecuting, So again, it wasn't a genuine apology, you can tell, because then he goes and does exactly the same thing. Another interesting example is Daksha. So Daksha criticizes Lord Shiva, similar to Parikshit criticizing Shamakarishi, criticizes Lord Shiva, who's in trance. And for this, we have a whole consequence that we're not going to talk about. And Daksha ends up with the head of a goat. And he apologizes to Lord Shiva through the goat's head. Not quite sure exactly how that works, but those are higher entities. I don't think he was just going, I think he was actually able to speak. And Sadhaputta would say how this proves that the mind is not just the brain, because he had a goat's brain. Anyway, he apologized to Lord Shiva. And then his next life, he does the same thing to Narada Muni. It's the same phenomena. So he appears to be apologetic, and then he goes and does the same thing. So these are some bad examples. The person is actually apologizing just to get rid of the consequences of their behavior. They're not apologizing to rectify. They're apologizing just so that they won't get in trouble. They'll smooth things over. Nobody will be mad at them. They won't get any consequences. So this is the bad apologies, when it's vague and incomplete acknowledgement. Well, maybe I hurt you in some ways, right? I love the one, I apologize. If you felt offended by what I did, I'm very sorry for that. I love that one. Using the passive voice, offenses may have been committed. I am so sorry for the offenses that were committed. By whom exactly? The offense is conditional. Well, I had a bad childhood and nobody loved me, and questioning whether or not you're actually damaged. Again, if you felt offended, or I'm sorry that you're so sensitive. Minimizing the offense, something, it was a small thing. Maybe from your perspective it was a small thing, but maybe not from their perspective it wasn't a small thing. Now, this is an interesting point. In English, we use the word sorry. Oh, my husband passed away. Oh, I'm so sorry. Why? Not that you killed him. So the word I'm sorry can just mean you have my sympathy. It's not, this is English. I don't know how this works in Hindi or Gujarati or Tamil, but, or Spanish, but at least in English, the word I'm sorry doesn't fully express an apology. I didn't sleep well last night. Oh, I'm really sorry for that. Again, it wasn't like I wasn't clanging gongs in the middle of the night. So it's suggested that we use the word I apologize rather than I'm sorry. Apologizing to the wrong party, again, apologizing to God when you hurt his devotee. Apologizing for the wrong thing. And consistently reoffending without recognition. Now, this is a tricky one, because if I hurt people, I cannot absolutely promise that I will never hurt them again. What I can promise is that I will try not to hurt them again, and I can promise that if I hurt them again and they bring it up to my attention, that I will try to immediately rectify. Now, certain things I could definitely promise. If it's something very, very serious and willful, if I stole money from you, that's that's something you can say, hey, I'm never going to steal money from you again. You follow? But if it's something like I said something that was insulting, or I said something at the wrong time in front of the wrong people, or I didn't show up when I said I was going, that's something I may mess up about again. So the kind of thing I'll say is, look, I'm really going to I'm going to try not to do this again. I'm really going to try not to mess up like this again. But if I mess up again, I please help me and let me know, and I'll immediately try to fix it. And, why do we give bad apologies? Because we're proud. We're proud. We want to think that I'm perfect. I never do anything wrong. So this is something that if someone had told me this when I joined the Hare Krishna movement, I might not have joined the Hare Krishna movement. I thought joining the Hare Krishna movement, I was within 2 or 3 months at most, that I was going to be experiencing unlimited ecstasy, thrill at every moment, and playing and dancing with Krishna and Vrindavan. And what I didn't realize is that in order to reach that stage, one has to recognize and acknowledge the fact that Bahirmukhe, that we've turned our face from Krishna, which is the ultimate sin. It's the ultimate offense, that I'm turning from my supreme beloved, kind, benefactor, Lord, which then manifests as all these other things. These are all the other mess ups we do are all symptoms of that one thing. And we have to be willing to see this. We're afraid that if we see this, that it will be excruciatingly painful. Because we all have experienced that awareness of our faults is painful. What is it painful to? Our false ego. It's not actually painful to us. It's painful to our false ego, our concept Ishwar Hamaham Bhogi, Siddhaham. That's what it's painful to. And so we think if I face it completely and I fully accept it and I fully acknowledge it, the pain will be unbearable. Looking at it just slightly, am I doing the avagya? Oh my God. Awful. And we think if I really look at it, I won't be able to bear it anymore. But actually, if we really look at it in terms of loving Krishna, that becomes a rasa. It becomes the ghastly rasa. Think about materially. If we've done something that hurts somebody that we really love and we really want a relationship with, and we genuinely restore the relationship. Maybe you're sitting on the couch next to your friend and you genuinely apologize and you genuinely rectify, you genuinely restore the relationship, and your friend puts their arm around you and says, it's okay, we're still friends. That's a rasa, isn't it? Yes. That's enhanced by your vulnerability and your humility and your rectification. Just like I'm much more likely to be a repeat customer of a company that rectifies than I am of a company that never messed up. Isn't that interesting? It deepens the relationship when they rectify. So if we see our faults not in terms of self-hatred, because we're not supposed to hate the self. If we hate the self, we're hating part of Krishna, and that's a problem. Atma Rama, Atma Tushta, Atma Ruchi. Krishna says you relish and rejoice in the self. And wow, what a glorious, wonderful self I am, and yet still I have chosen to be in illusion. I've chosen to be in rebellion. How regrettable this is. My dear Lord, I'm sorry. Really, when we are rectifying with any other jiva, ultimately we are rectifying with Krishna. And it can be extremely sweet. And our only block to this is pride. There is no other block. We could say fear, that I'm afraid if I acknowledge nobody will love me anymore and they'll throw me out and nobody will talk to me anymore. But that's also pride. So if they do, they do. I'm willing to accept, like Marsbrick, and I'm willing to accept whatever happens. So we're going to work on writing an apology, but first I want to do, just if you could get in some groups, and I would like you just to talk about 3 things. How can we better take responsibility? And then a little bit, we already talked about what happens when we do it right and what happens when we do it wrong. But mostly I want you to focus just in groups of 3, maybe someone you did not work with yesterday. And how can we better fix what we mess up? And after we do this, you're all going to practice writing an apology. That will be just for yourself. That will not be shared. Unless you want to share it with somebody. Okay, so if you could please get in groups of 3. And again, if you could maybe work with someone you haven't worked with. And what can we do? Don't discuss details of things, but just from a theoretical platform, okay? This is not a psychological analysis session, but just theoretically, philosophically, how can we better take responsibility? What? How can we better take responsibility for our mess-ups? That is the question. How can we better take responsibility for our mess-ups? And after this, we're going to practice writing an apology. Okay, thank you. So what I'd like us to do now, you have the handout. You have the handout that lists what I had up on the screen, but in more detail of what is a good and not good apology. So we're going to take 5 minutes. You may want to work on this more later on your own. This is just for you. You don't need to share with anybody in this room. I'd like you can go at this from several angles. I want us all to practice writing a good apology. Okay? So if you can think of somebody that you need to apologize to, you can write it to them and maybe give it to them later. If they've left this world, you can put it in front of a picture of them. You might also want to write an apology to yourself. That's another alternative. If there's some behaviors you're doing that are hurting yourself. If neither of those are applicable, another thing you can do is write the kind of apology you might want somebody to write to you. So if you can think of somebody, like I can definitely think of one person in my life who's several times given me very, very poor apologies for, like, just repeatedly given me very, very poor apologies. And the last time said, do you accept my apology? And I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever. It was just useless. I was never going to get a proper apology from this person. So that's another possibility that you can, but I want you to practice the form of an apology. Okay? I want you to have a practice with this. So either to somebody else that you really, and if you can't think of anybody, you can ask Krishna, tell me, and maybe he'll do what he did for me and say, oh, it was this one. Or maybe you need to apologize to yourself. Maybe you need to apologize to God. Or if you can't think of any of that at the present moment, to write it as if you were someone else writing to you. So we're going to take 5 minutes for that. And you should have everything in your handout. And I really want you to take the time to do this. Please, if you don't do that, then this is going to remain theoretical for you. I mean, if you have a meeting with the King of England, what can be done? But I'd really like you to try to do this. And I'll put this slide back up, but it's much more in detail in the handout than it is in the slide. And please just do this on your own. This is not a group activity. This is not a group activity. This is not a group activity. Should I say it again? This is not a group activity. Thanks. I want you to actually write this, please. You don't have to. You can do whatever you want. You're a free-willed living entity. If you would really like to get the most benefit out of this, I would really humbly suggest that you do this. And to do it now while it's fresh in your brain. going to take another 2 minutes. Okay, just a super quick. No, we're fine. It's fine. Right, but then I have to do this and do this and do this. Super quick, I don't want to take more than 1 or 2 minutes for this. Just any one word or quick phrase about your response to doing this exercise. Just one word or a phrase. Humbling, okay? Anybody else? One word or like a quick phrase, yes? What? Recognizing mistakes, okay? Let's put recognition. Is that all right? Responsibility. Content. Feeling contentment. Anybody else? Enlightening. Woo. Okay, relief. Anybody else? Yes, all the way in the back? Positive attitude. Okay. We're going to write positivity. Is that all right? Will that work? Closure. Pause and introspect. Okay. Okay, so my last thing that I would like to leave you with, would we want to be part of a community where this is the norm? Because we are going to have problems. In any community, we're going to have problems. Maybe they're going to be, some of them are going to be serious problems. Some of them are going to be minor problems. We are going to have problems. And how we fix things and how we restore things is so important if we're going to have a community. Otherwise, people have like open wounds they're walking around with for decades sometimes. Yes? Yes? Okay, so again, thank you very much. Anything good in this presentation, I owe to Srila Prabhupada, to the Shastra, to our Acharyas. Any mistakes here are mine. If you can please take the good and either correct or leave aside the mistakes. This afternoon, we're going to be looking at, Krishna willing, some more things with Career Dharma, with Varnashram. And I've decided, based on the response I got yesterday afternoon, that I'm going to spend the first hour looking at the most, I think, the most wow part of this, and that is what happens when you do work that's not your work. What happens when you go into the wrong field? What happens to us personally? What happens to society? Because this was the thing that my co-author Rukmini and I, when we came to this, we went, Krishna's really smart. This is why Prabhupada's emphasizing this. I'm going to spend an hour on that, then probably a half an hour looking at how the fields work in community. And then we should have a half an hour for general discussion. So that's how I'm planning it for this afternoon. If you were here yesterday, please bring your handouts, because we do not have another set of handouts to give you. So please bring them with you. And then this evening for the Sunday feast, looks like I'm going to be giving a half an hour presentation on Lord Shiva, and has music and stuff. So again, thank you. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.